Back in November, we got wind that the Biden administration had collected over 54 million gun records in the last year, and that seemed troubling to us. That seemed like an astronomical figure to us.
Hey guys, it's Phil with GOA, and I'm wearing my favorite GOA sweater and talking to this week's man of the match, Congressman Michael Cloud, Texas 27. We're going to talk a lot today about the Second Amendment and, in particular, the ATF and the work Congressman Cloud has been doing on the ATF to do some very necessary oversight. So, Congressman Cloud, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Before we get into your work over the last 2 weeks on the ATF, just tell us, what's your view of the Second Amendment? Why do we have it? What's its purpose?
Yeah, Second Amendment is so essential to the liberties and the freedoms we enjoy as Americans. We can talk about hunting rights and gaming, but it's really about protecting us from tyranny, protecting us from the overreach of a tyrannical government one day that our founders had to deal with personally. And so they understood the importance of people being free and the ability they would have to protect themselves and to keep them and their families safe. And so that's what the Second Amendment's all about.
Yeah, it's good to see a lot more people in the public square recognizing that and not calling them, modern sporting rifles. Like, they are rifles. They are there to protect us from, potentially a tyrannical government, God forbid. So,
Yeah, God forbid.
sort of moving on to the great work you've been doing. I called you the man of the match because you've done something that a lot of people haven't been able to do, which is cut through the noise. In Washington, as you know, you've been here long enough, there's hundreds of competing interests for your time and attention, right? There's healthcare, there's the border, there's foreign policy, there's budget, spending.
We got a couple things we need to fix in government, yes.
Yeah, just a few things.
Just a few things.
But what you've been able to do with your oversight is start getting at the heart of what the ATF is doing and the collection of records. Can you walk us through the work you've been doing on that and sort of educate the viewer?
Sure. Yeah. Back in November, we got wind that the Biden administration had collected over 54 million gun records in the last year, and that seemed troubling to us. That seemed like an astronomical figure to us. And so, working with GOA, we looked into what was going on there. We sent a letter to the ATF, and we got a response. We actually got a response. Sometimes you wonder if you're going to get one. We got a response, and they said that they had collected almost a billion gun records on American citizens. Now, we already have a law in place that prohibits the federal government from enacting a federal gun registry. And they have digitized already over 90% of those records into a searchable format. And so at what point does this not become a registry? I mean, to any American you ask, Americans are very concerned about this issue. Certainly a searchable database on gun records seems like a registry, even if you're not going to put that label on it. And so this is very concerning to the American people.
Yeah, they're sort of playing word games, right? It's in their view, it's not technically a registry, but if you have a billion records of transactions, 90% of them are digitized, and they know how to search them, that looks like the beginnings of a registry to me.
Ignoring the spirit of the law and just not putting the label on it technically. It's obvious, it seems, to the American people of what could be going on here. And so we're continuing the investigation to look into it.
One of the things that I noticed about this was, you've actually been able to bring other people along with you to talk about this thing. You're obviously, as far as, a member of the House, you've been a leader on this, but one of the coolest things, you've gotten other people to join you and basically follow. What's it like, over the last 2 weeks being the guy when it comes to gun rights in the United States?
Well, first of all, it was great to have 50 other members of Congress join us in that initial letter to say, hey, this is something we need to be looking into. We need to be making sure that our federal government is not putting law-abiding citizens under unnecessary scrutiny. And so that was great. But once the story began to break and people began to get word about what the ATF was doing, the response has been phenomenal. People reaching out. We've had a number of senators reach out to our office. We're continuing the work of the investigation, but we're also beginning the work of forming the legislation to deal with this particular issue as well. But to see the response from the American people just shows you how the American people are engaged on this issue, how they understand how important our Second Amendment rights are, and the constitutional limits that should be placed on the federal government.
Yeah, you've actually shown other members of Congress, House and Senate, you've shown candidates, you've shown the American people that fighting on the Second Amendment is going to reap you so many rewards from the American people, because this is something they want. They don't want the registries. They don't want the gun control. they want their freedoms back. And I think
Yeah,
you've proven that.
it goes back to that founding principle our nation were founded upon. One thing that sets apart America as different from virtually every other nation on earth is that our nation is a people with a government, not a government with a people. And so the Constitution, we the people of the United States of America, have instituted a government, and our Constitution was written to put limiting restrictions on the federal government so that the people could remain free. And so the Second Amendment is definitely part of that construct. And we have to make sure that we're doing governments are going to, power is going to naturally seep toward the government if we don't, as representatives of the people of the United States, make sure that we're providing that check on an expanding government and making sure that power remains with the people.
I want to talk about the follow-up letter you sent to the ATF. Before we do that,
Yeah.
how instrumental have the grassroots been in you getting this message out? Because you really,
Yeah.
you can use supporters and followers almost as leverage against other members of Congress and against these agencies
Yeah.
who maybe they don't want to answer your letter, but they understand if they don't, there's going to be consequences at the voting.
Right. Well, the American people rising up, contacting the representative, their senators about these sort of issues, asking them to join in the discussion and in the fight to protect and preserve our rights is so essential. Believe it or not, Congress can be responsive when the American people rise up. And certainly the bureaucracy, while slow moving, when there's enough of an outcry of people addressing these issues, have to respond and have to give some sort of response to it. Now, of course, we're looking forward to Congress hopefully shifting the makeup. I'm on the oversight committee, and we're not going to wait for anything along those lines to happen for us to have more investigative authority and power to have subpoenas, for example, to look into this. We're going to continue to ask those questions, and until then, continue to prepare the legislative solutions for this, and just encourage the American people to continue to be a voice.
This is almost one of the things that sort of feeds off of each other. Going back a few months to sort of the disastrous vote on the National Defense Authorization Act, which we've actually talked about on this channel before. There was gun confiscation in there.
Right.
A lot of members got a lot of heat for that.
Right.
And there was an overwhelming response from gun owners and from voters not to do that, even if there was some sort of, backroom deal about that kind of thing. And I think with the strong response Congress got from that, it almost makes them less willing to push for gun control and makes it easier for someone like you to, try and do some oversight. So now comes your letter that's a response back to the ATF once they told you that there was 1 billion records that they had collected. What's in that letter and what kind of response can you expect from them?
Yeah, well, we're sitting that second letter. One thing we found out, we're talking about almost 1 billion records. That's as far as we know on one of potentially 16 servers that the government has. And so we want to find out what's going on with the rest of that and what the uses are and all of, just to get more into the details of what's happening there. We are looking into what we can do to make sure that the ATF stays within the bounds of the law, but then also looking at, okay, we probably need to bring some legal challenges, change some statutes to make sure that we're not putting the Second Amendment rights of its citizens at play. And you mentioned, for example, the NDAA. Even if there was some backroom deal, the Second Amendment constitutional inalienable rights of the people shouldn't be a negotiating block. That should be a given in any sort of legislation we're bringing to the table. And so it was great of you all to be involved, and great of the American people to rise up and make sure their voice was heard on those issues.
So let's say hypothetically that the ATF decides that the first time they responded to your letter, they got crushed and they don't want to respond to your letter. Like, Congress is the answer here, right? You brought it up. The answer is a legislative solution. I think sometimes, we like to defer to the courts to do the job of Congress, and the courts have certainly their purpose, but it really is the role of Congress to step in and cure these problems when they arise. So, if the ATF doesn't respond to your answer, we're looking at leaders like you to try and fix it.
Yeah, and there's a couple ways we can go about that. One is the investigative stream,
Hmm.
certainly, but then there's the funding and defunding. You fund what you want to see,
Yeah.
and you defund what you don't want to see. And so those are options. All of those options are on the table as we're looking to move forward on this issue.
So speaking of options and funding and defunding, the Biden administration seems to have turned everything on its head, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they
exactly.
want to restrict gun rights, while in other
Hmm.
areas they're almost calling for lawlessness and not law and order. Like when you sort of see Americans having their rights restricted, and yet looking at the policies from the administration, like what does that make you think?
Yeah, I'm from South Texas, and so we know the border like no one else in this nation. And granted, it's affecting community after community after community. But the fact that our federal government can't keep track of who's coming into our country, but yet we have a billion gun records on law-abiding American citizens, that becomes troubling. In the last year, we've seen the Biden administration place threat tags on parents attending school board meetings.
Hmm.
We've seen in the past the military want to set up an office within the DoD to investigate members in the military, in their political leanings and those sorts of things. We've seen in the past the IRS target people of certain political conservatives specifically on different sort of things. And so you can see how a federal government unchecked will misuse and abuse its power for nefarious means. And so we have to make sure that we're not doing this. And it's interesting, in that letter that the ATF sent back, because they'll try to claim that this is all for law enforcement purposes,
Hmm.
right? But they even admit in their letter, it says the ATF, and I quote here, has no ability to determine the successful prosecution of hundreds of thousands of crime gun traces it completes annually. And so hundreds of thousands of traces. We have no idea from the ATF if there's any sort of law enforcement value to them or not. And so for us, for them to continue to come and push the narrative like, oh, this is all for law enforcement purposes, yeah, we're gonna have to see more proof than because right now we have no proof that that's actually the case. And to anyone looking at this issue, this is a gun registry on law-abiding citizens. And what you're saying about the incentive structure being messed up is totally. We see lawlessness being embraced and those who commit crimes emboldened. We see people getting out of prison who've committed heinous crimes. We see people coming across our border who are doing. The number one killer in America right now is fentanyl coming across our border. So all this stuff it gets the check of okay from this administration. Meanwhile, we see those who are an extra layer of scrutiny placed on law-abiding American citizens. One of the proposals that was coming across the last year was to monitor the expenditures and checking accounts of virtually every American. This is the kind of thing that needs to be pushed back on. Why our Constitution is in place and why those liberties that the American people are supposed to have and the limits that are supposed to be placed on the federal government must continue to be fought for and protected by those of us serving in government. But we need the voice of the American people continuing to be engaged on this at every level.
Yeah, sort of wrapping up here, you brought up you can't keep records longer than 20 years.
Yeah.
And yet through executive action, the Biden administration wants to have that go, into perpetuity for all the records. And so really that
Yes,
is
exactly.
almost by definition a
Claiming for law
full-fledged
enforcement, right? Claiming
registry.
for law enforcement
Yeah.
purposes. Right now, you go buy a handgun at your FFL. They keep that record for 20 years. If they go out of business, those records go what was supposed to be considered temporary storage to
Hmm.
the ATF. The Biden administration is looking at lifting that temporary limit to where this would be kept indefinitely. Even with that limit on it, all right, they've already accumulated this mass database. Even with those limits, they're looking to take those limits off when really we should be going the other way.
And one of the things that your letter brought out, got the ATF to admit, was that, what is it? Most of these handgun traces don't go back more than 7 years.
Yeah, exactly. When you're looking at quote time to crime and those sort of things, uh, it's hard to have any sort of idea that there's any sort of value to these records being kept for 3 to 7 years or anything longer than that. So that's the kind of details that we're
Mhm.
trying to get into. And just there's the constitutional aspect still when we come back to the fact
Yeah.
of should they even be doing this? Is this something that's better handled locally and those kind of things when it comes to it? But when it comes to the Second Amendment constitutional uh, principles, we have to make sure that this government stays within the limits that it's supposed to be operating under.
Well, I think the moral of the story here is that proper oversight is not hard. It's not impossible. It just takes some time and some dedication, and for members of
Yeah.
Congress to stick with it. And you know, what you did was write a letter, and you worked with GOA, and you stuck with it. And through that, you were able to get everybody talking about this issue. To me, anyway, as a gun owner and somebody who's with GOA, that's the moral of the story: is that members of Congress performing proper oversight
Yeah.
is one of the most important things we can do. And through that,
Yeah.
who knows what wins we can get, on rolling back the ATF, rolling back gun control. So,
And you
if
can
we,
never discount the voice of the American people in
yeah,
in this. It's so important. Otherwise, it's just a blip. It's a blip on the
yeah.
radar, and it's the American people stepping up and hearing the voice and becoming part of the process that really makes it a game changing moment.
Well, I have a feeling you're not going to let it be a blip.
No, we're not going to let it
So
be a blip.
appreciate your time, guys. That's it for this week. We'll see you next time here with Congressman Michael Cloud, Texas 27.